g'day everybody and welcome to this week's podcast. This week's podcast of Tell Us Something That We Don't Know, a serious chat with a comedian. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today is one of Australia's best known comedians. You name it, he's done it. There's no more accomplished performer in Australia than Vince Sorrenti. Not only has he entertained us for almost 40 years with his stand-up routines, but he's also led his acute observations to writing and presenting in every facet of entertainment. Perhaps more importantly, he's one of the most influential characters in the Australian comedy landscape. He was there in the important emerging stages of the Australian comedy scene and he's still going strong today. His career has stood the test of time, which is a testament to him. But his insight is invaluable, and that's why I'm very excited to talk to him today. Vince, how are you, mate?
G'day, Joe. Thanks for the rap, mate.
No worries, did you like it?
Almost important.
You can charge more now.
I will, thank you for that.
Now, before we begin, I just want to say that probably you were my first introduction to comedy because I remember I might have been around about 10, 11 years old. I was at the Conquador, right? So for those people listening out of Sydney and over around the world, Conquador is an Italian establishment where every Italian got married, right? And I don't know who was getting married, but you were a special guest. You came and entertained us that night. Wow. And I just remember looking at you going, gee, look at this guy. Like the whole room is just in fits of laughter. And that, even before I did stand-up, that memory stood out for me as a kid throughout all my whole childhood. And I think probably you were responsible for sowing the seed for me wanting to be a comedian, unconsciously, I think. You know?
I have a very similar story, Joe. The first comic I ever saw was at a wedding as well. I mean, I saw Keith Scott, the great impressionist, at a mate's wedding. I would have only been about 14 or 15 years of age.
Right.
There wasn't comedy clubs and I didn't know any comics. I'd never heard of stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
So it was actually at a wedding that I saw my first comic as well.
Wow, that's it. I never knew that. One thing that I will say, which is another thing that we have in common, is which is really interesting, both of our fathers, I just want to get this out of the way straight away because I think it's really important. Both of our fathers
Disclosure.
Come from exactly the same little town in Italy. Not the same region, not the same, the same little town. I think I love telling people that story.
We are, is it third cousins?
I don't know.
I think is it that your grandmother and my grandmother were cousins? Is that right?
I think so.
I think that's yeah.
So there should have been more comedians.
Yeah, don't have to dig too far to get relations in southern Italy, mate.
So let's start talking about you, mate. So how did you get into comedy? Give us a bird's eye view. I know you were studying architecture, right?
I was. I always had my heart set on being an architect. I think when so much of your ancestry and relatives are in the concrete and building industry, being an architect was kind of the next generational leap forward. So that's what I always wanted to be. I was halfway through architecture school, and I never wanted to get into comedy because really there was no comedy scene. I mean, not that I knew of anyway. I mean, there were people on TV and, I always wanted to be a performer, but the comedy scene pretty much started at the right time for me, around 1981, I think it was. The Comedy Store opened. And
where was the Comedy Store back then? Where was it?
It was
in Jamison Street?
Under a nightclub in Jamison Street.
Yeah, right,
Jamison Street was one of the coolest, hippest nightclubs, and I say this quite seriously, in the world. Right. I mean, Sydney's 1980s club scene was like top shelf. People rave about it in London and New York, and Jamison Street was the place. And the owner of Jamison Street also owned the Comedy Store, which was downstairs. So we were in like the chicest, hippest environment. I mean, it was such a thrill going to work every day at the Comedy Store.
And so who was there that knows that? Who started it? So there would have been Rodney Roode, it was yourself?
There was Rodney Roode, there was Ostentatious, there was George Smilovich, there was Rick Carter. That was kind of the hard Graham Pugh in those early days. In fact, it was a friend of Ostentatious's, a girlfriend of mine at uni, who was also studying architecture. She came up to me and we had just finished an architecture review, which I was usually in and I would write and direct and have a big say in. And she said, oh, look, Vince, there's a new restaurant, they called it, in the city where people get up on stage and make people laugh.
Right.
And my friend of mine, Sandy Goodman, Ostentatious, is working there, and
Yep.
they're looking for people to come down there. So I had no idea. I'd never even seen this sort of phenomena before. So I dragged myself down there and got up and did a few skits from a review that we'd just done.
Yeah.
And people laughed, thank God. I mean, I was very nervous. My God, I remember I was physically shaking. I was holding my leg because it was wobbling so much. And I came off stage that night, and Rodney Roode was the MC. He was the first stand-up comic I saw, and he was on 5 minutes before I was.
Yeah.
He said, "You really enjoyed that, didn't you?" I said, "Yeah, I loved it." He said, "You will be a comic for the rest of your life."
Yeah, wow. He's a cool bloke,
right? He was, mate, he was, I know he's got this reputation these days of being sort of politically incorrect and rude and, out there and stuff, but, mate, he was absolutely incredible. I mean, the comics would sit around in awe watching him on stage. I learnt so much from Rodney Roode.
Yeah.
A lot of the way I speak on stage, the highs and the lows, all comes from Rodney Roode. He was a great teacher and mentor.
Yeah. Cool. Were you funny as a kid, though?
Yes. Yeah. I was naughty and funny.
Well, I was going to say that. My dad said he remembers you, and he remembers you being naughty. He goes, geez, he was naughty when he was a kid.
Yeah, mate, I was, those idiot kids that you just slide around on the floor at the wedding reception. I was one of those, and, if there was a fight somewhere with the relos, we'd put all our singlets off and, like wrestling around, that I'd be one of them. Yeah. I wasn't sort of, I was kind of good at home. I only had a sister to fight with at home, but I was an agent of provocation and disaster in those days. And the same at school too. I was not in serious trouble, but always in some sort of trouble at school.
Yeah. And you grew up around Punch Bowl, I remember you talking about that in your show a lot.
Yeah.
Now, when you started at the Comedy Store, was it so there was a handful of comics who were getting up there, and if you were pretty decent, were you bound to get on TV in those days? Talk to us about that. I'm really interested in how you go from starting doing stand-up on stage and then getting to TV.
TV wanted to have nothing to do with comics at the beginning. It was, in fact, I think in hindsight, TV was very threatened by that whole, because, stand-up comedy exploded. Onto the stages. Yeah. And there were comedy clubs all over Sydney. You could work in a different room every night in those days. But I think they were very wary about us on TV because people try and put labels on new things, and they called us new wave comedians. They said we were punk comics because we swore too much, but we weren't swearing as much, anywhere near as much, or any more than the generation of sort of club comics and older guys that preceded us. Yeah. But I think we were viewed as I remember my first appearance on TV was on the Mike Walsh show, the midday show.
Yeah, I remember.
Which in those days was huge. Yeah. To be on TV in the 80s is nothing like being on TV now.
I want to talk about that. Yeah, tell us about that.
I remember doing my first, my biggest break in showbiz, hands down, would be when I appeared on the Mike Walsh Tonight Show.
Right.
Now, he took over from, there was the Don Lane show, there was the Bert Newton show, and Mike Walsh was the show when I was just starting off. And I jumped through this giant screen saying, "I see it, but I don't believe it." There was a head there, and I did this routine. Mate, the reaction was phenomenal. Seriously, as I was driving home that night from the studio, they were advertising the fact that I was going to be on the next week.
Wow.
Everyone knew my name. That night, I went out, everyone knew people watched a lot more TV in those. Well, there was less TV to watch.
Yeah.
I often give the example of the Paul Hogan show, which was very, very popular at the time. Yeah. If you didn't watch the Paul Hogan show, you literally had nothing to talk about at school for like 3 weeks. You know what I mean? Everyone watched.
I remember.
The ratings were just through the roof. Yeah. Everyone's on TV. Plumbers, fat people, and and single people and renovators are on TV now. It's no big deal being on TV now. In fact, TV is the end of your career if you're an entertainer these days. But in those days, being on TV was huge. TV stars were really stars. To give you another example, Ray Martin. Ray Martin had a contract for $2 million a year in 1990. Like, that's 31 years ago, and that's more than anyone is earning on TV today.
Yeah.
By a factor of 2. So that's how much TV has decreased in sort of like popularity and sort of as a medium.
Yeah, because becoming famous back then is different to becoming famous now, isn't it?
Oh, very, very. I mean, we're on the internet. That's the greatest example of all.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more. So get in a bit more detail. So you've gone on to was it the Mike Walsh show, the Night Show, right? And from there, you sort of became. How long did it take really to become a household name? I mean, I know you said like overnight, but was that a national show or was it just in Sydney? That show?
It was a very big national show, huge ratings.
Right.
It was a big show to do. If you wanted to see, TV was used as a means of breaking into showbiz a lot more in those days. I mean, these days, if you're a comic or a singer or whatever, how do you get known on TV? You've got to lower yourself to compete on one of these X Factor or sort of The Voice or any, when you're up against amateurs, like there really is no place to break into showbiz these days. And TV has really lost that power of influence. But yeah, look, mate, comics were releasing albums. That was the other big thing.
Yeah, well, Ostentatious had that Australiana, which was number one. Did you have a CD? Did you have an album?
I had an album called Unbelievable, which charted in most Australian cities. Yeah. And it was recorded live in one of these big suburban comedy clubs I was talking about before. Yeah. But Ostentatious' single Australiana it was the biggest selling single of 1983. Yeah. And one of the biggest of the decade. So comedy was very popular, mate. And to be at the Comedy Store, I mean, all the stars came to I met Raquel Welch at the Comedy Store. If a big star was in town, they came to I met Sly Stallone at the Comedy Store. Right. It was the place to be nationally. It was amazing. Yeah. Very, very exciting times.
Yeah. And could you make a living back in those days just from doing the circuit?
Oh, my God, you could. Yeah, but I was a student. I was a student. I was still going to uni, and I was working at night as a comic. Yep. I was making $1,000 a week in 1981.
That's pretty 82. Good money in those days.
But I was a kid. I was I was doing my homework on the side.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And then where did you go from there? So did you just start doing a lot more clubs? But then did you have like a big TV gig? I remember seeing you presenting here and there. I mean, you had a few things that you did. I remember seeing, but
Hey Hey It's Saturday was
stand-up.
Hey Hey It's Saturday became the sort of like it was one of the first shows that really recognised the power of stand-up comics. Yeah. And Hey Hey was a hugely popular show as well. It was compulsory viewing on Saturday nights and was very cool too. A lot of people sort of look back on Hey Hey and think it was a bit daggy, but it was to do Hey Hey. It was like the Dave Letterman show of Australia. It was like very cool. I saw you on Hey Hey. Yeah. Very cool. You know what I mean? Yeah. So there was a comic on every week on Hey Hey. And, Sydney comics would fly down there to Melbourne and local Melbourne comics. I mean, we got to know the Melbourne comics. There was the Melbourne Comedy Festivals too, which was still in its infancy in those days. But, with the albums, with the sort of the TV coverage we were getting, comedy was really popular. I mean, there was someone coined the phrase like rock and roll comedy because comics were literally touring like big bands and selling out not stadiums, but like they'd be at music festivals. They were at they were in sort of big rock and roll band style barns, and rooms. Yeah. So it was everywhere. Comedy. I mean, comedy names were on sort of every billboard under every bridge in Australia.
And when did you really start getting into the corporates? Because you're pretty much the corporate comedy king, really. I don't think anyone does more corporate shows than you. No, when did you get into that more?
Well, mate, I didn't. It's nothing I planned to do. It's I had some time in the States too. I worked on MTV in New York. I worked all the clubs in the northeast of the US, and I ended up and I did get a TV show in those days. This is to give you an idea of how little Australian TV executives thought about stand-up comedy, they didn't really know how to use it.
Right.
I mean, unless you were sort of doing a bit on Hey Hey or one of the Tonight shows,
Yep.
the only other way that they thought about using a comedian was to be the host of like a game show or something.
Yeah.
I became the host of Let's Make a Deal, for God's sake,
Right.
in the early 1990s.
Yeah.
It was kind of after that, because that kind of made me a little bit more mainstream to
Yeah.
sort of the corporates, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I started doing a lot more corporate events. It's not. I didn't plan it. It just happened that way, and I really started to like it. I mean, bear in mind, I'd been touring for like 15 years. I'd done every room in Australia 10 times over, and you can get sick of it, believe it or not. And the thing about corporate comedy is, or conferences and private events, social events, that sort of thing, is that apart from the money being a lot better, you have to engage a lot more. You're not just getting up on stage and doing your own shit each day and people will lap it up or not lap it up. But with the corporates, you've really got to talk to them. You've got to understand what they find is funny. You've got to understand a little bit about why they're there and what their business is about, and who's who in the zoo, if you know what I mean. And it's much more engaging. It's kind of like applied comedy. And I think if you find a niche for yourself there, if you find something, if there's something about you that they like, and what they've always liked about me is that I'm very topical. I like to talk about what's going on in the news, what's going on socially, like how people are reacting to geopolitical and Aussie events, and I like to put my finger on what the average Aussie is thinking. That's always been my shtick, and the corporates love it, and I love them because it's a great gig, and it's a gig that's always going to be with you.
Yeah. Now, you've stood the test of time. Some people come and go, and you've done very well, and you're still doing really well. What do you think is the secret, apart from what you've told? Not the secret, but what do you think? Why do you think that you've lasted this long? Obviously you're funny, Joe. And you keep,
I love it.
Yeah.
I can never see a time when I'm not doing this. I mean, I would, if I was retired, I would never go to a comedy show. I couldn't sit in a room. I wouldn't even watch a TV show about comedy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to sit down and watch someone else being funny. I want to be that person. I've always wanted to be that person. And, enormous success has eluded me. Like, I've never been Jerry Seinfeld, and I've never been Eddie Murphy, and I've never been, whoever you want to throw up there.
Yeah.
But I've always been pretty well regarded, and I love what I do, and I hope people just keep letting me do it for as long as I'm on this earth.
Yeah. So who makes you laugh, Vince?
Oh, look, I think Joe, that if you're a comic, you really appreciate comedy. Well, and everyone makes me laugh. Even comics that are generally disregarded by a lot of people make me laugh. There's something about every comic, and I admire every comic. People that make fun of comics or denigrate comedy, I just have no truck with, because unless you've stood on that stage, unless you've wanted to make that audience laugh like I do, I don't care what you think.
Yeah, well, that's nice. Actually, it's nice to hear, because normally comedians can be really bitchy. We're
all bitchy, man. We're all competitive. That's my line. Hey, what's he doing there? Hang on, I used to do a bit like that. Hey, that's not funny. I'm funny.
Yeah. Now, you said in the past that on a recent podcast, you said you never really liked the ethnic comedy genre. What didn't you like about it?
Well, I don't dislike it. I just don't do it anymore, and for no other reason as if I'm bored with it. I mean, there's nothing. I don't. I still find it funny. It's just not for me. It's not my shtick. And us comics always talk about what our shtick is, and that might be your shtick or someone else's shtick. It's not my shtick. I like talking about what's going on now, and I sometimes. I mean, I did all that stuff, as you would well know. I mean, I was talking about those sort of things back in the early '80s when it was maybe had a little bit more friction around it in those times. I mean, it's become a genre now. I mean, you see all manner of people doing it now, and that's good. I think it's I think there's a place for it, particularly with and I notice you've been doing this too with the newer arrivals. I think it really is a window into into their cultures. I mean, the Vietnamese and the Sudanese and what have you. And I think we kind of supplied that with the Italians and Greeks and whatever back in the early '80s. I think I think it really does. I think it creates a connection between newer and older Australians.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about a point which is a bit of a sore point for a lot of comedians. I think is the whole PC world and the whole cancel culture and woke. And what's your thoughts on that? Because I know you do have some strong thoughts.
Yeah,
about
look, I have thoughts and I don't have thoughts, Joe. Let me explain. I completely and utterly disregard talk about political correctness. I mean, what's funny today is never going to be funny in 20 years. And what was funny 20 years ago, we don't find funny now. I mean, and you can disappear up your own backside, trying to explain this and justify it. But comedy's always changing. I mean, I watched an episode of Fawlty Towers the other day, the Germans episode, which I thought was hilarious when I was in my teens and is considered one of the classic episodes in one of the classic sitcoms ever made, And you view it through today's eyes and you think, my God, this is outrageous. It's so racist. It's so bigoted, but it was still so fun. You could never get away with what John Cleese was doing then today. Monty Python, who I've always regarded as like being geniuses of comedy. You look back at Monty Python, there was not one woman in the Monty Python team. They never spoke about women. Even the women they portrayed were guys dressed as women. All the greats, the goodies of those times, Python. And to view it today, it's just misogynistic, sort of like man-dominated, narrow-minded. But it was brilliant. But you can't look at something through the prism of another time. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's comedy is for now, and that comedy was for then, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that it would be a lot harder for the comedians today starting out, or do you think it's equally as hard as when you started?
It's the same. It is. Look, it was harder because people didn't understand comedy. I mean, that's the only big difference. I mean, these days there's a comedy scene, there's comedy clubs, audiences know how to react. I mean, audiences didn't know how to react in 1980, mate. You walked onto a stage and started being funny, people would throw stuff at you. You try and stand on the stage at the Ride Hotel, on a Wednesday night when everyone's roaring drunk and say, "Oh, now we've got a comedy show." People are a lot more civilised now, but I think to answer your question more specifically, it's no harder for comics now. I mean, this whole political correctness thing is an excuse. I mean, being funny is still being funny, and I've never offended an intelligent person. And if you listen to anything I say, and if you try and box that into a politically correct container, you won't be able to, because if you say something smart, it's always going to be smart. And I have no truck with the whole PC argument. I never engage in an argument with a politically correct agent. I view it like it's like arguing with someone who thinks the Earth's flat. If you haven't seen the photos, mate, then nothing I say in the next 5 minutes is going to change your mind. So, no, I won't have a bar of it.
And you mentioned how rough it was back in those days. I mean, apart from the pub gigs, what was the worst gig you ever did that you can remember?
Oh.
Because I had one recently.
Yeah.
So I had one, recently, but...
Well, tell me your one.
What was my one? Is that giving you time to think of one?
No, I've got one. I've got plenty. Don't worry.
Okay. Well, let me tell you mine and I'll tell you yours. I got asked to do a gig for a bus company in Sydney. And I did all my sort of homework And as you know, because you do a million more corporates than I do, I said, how many people? What's the room like? All that kind of stuff. There was 700-800 bus drivers. And I said, nah, that's just not, I just know it's not going to work. It's in a massive, it was in Homebush and in this massive warehouse. It was just, the sound and everything was just not going to work. The agent came back and said, they want you, name your price. I pulled out a stupid figure, triple what I would normally get. He comes back and goes, yep, no problem. I thought, well, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die.
Die rich.
I'll make this money. Anyway, I get there. They had all sorts of bands, impressionists, magician. Like they would have spent at least $250,000 on entertainment. Wow. The distance between the edge of the stage and the first table was about 30 meters. Right? There wasn't 700 people. There was 1,200 people. Right? In the middle of my, I don't know, someone was looking down on me. I was dying. The people weren't interested in hearing me. In the middle of my show, the fire alarm goes off.
Oh, yeah. Perfect.
And just say 12 minutes into my half, and the whole place evacuated. And that was it. And somebody was just looking after me. And that was recent. That was probably just before COVID.
Well, mate, you've reminded me of two. I had one in mind I was going to tell you, but you just reminded me of two other terrible gigs that I've done. But the one I was going to tell you about was, with comedy, as you were setting that death up, you become more discerning as a comic. Yeah. You kind of know when a gig's going to be bad and the setup's wrong, and you can smell it a mile off.
And it's always the highest paying gigs are the worst.
No one will do it otherwise. And I remember getting this gig, and I was only in my early days in the corporate scene. Would have been in the mid-90s. And so many of my corporate competitors had knocked this gig back, and it was a big paying gig. It was at the International Robotics Convention in Singapore, in the huge convention. I flew over there business class. I thought, you guys are crazy. You passed up on this gig. This is an amazing gig. I walked out on this stage, and this room, I mean, you'd think we've got big convention centres here. You could put 4 Queen Marys in this room, and there were like 300 people there, and it looked like an ant, in a shoebox. It was just so big. And International Robotics Convention, there were 33 different nationalities in the audience. Maybe 4 or 5 of them understood English. The only time they laughed was when I swore. So, I learned I died on my arse. But the bit you said about people leaving the room, I was doing a gig in New York, and I'd been working over there. I'd been doing great in the clubs, and a mate of mine came to visit me, and I said, "Oh, mate, I'm playing at Stand Up New York. Come and see me. It's Jerry Seinfeld's club." And he sits in the audience, and I get introduced onto the stage, and as I get introduced, the entire audience stands up and leaves. And there was this bus had pulled up, and there was the whole audience was a tour group, right? And their bus pulled up. As soon as I get introduced, everyone stands except my mate and walks out of the room. So that's a tough way to die as well.
And are your kids funny? Do you think any of them will end up in entertainment?
Yeah, maybe. But mate, I tell you what, and goes back to this argument about with this notion about how comedy changes with time. I barely understand their humour. I mean, they're laughing at stuff on their phones, and I look at it and I go, "You think that's funny?" Yeah. It's seriously. I feel really old and out of touch. They find chubby animals funny, and I mean, some of these memes they're sending around to their friends of like chubby cats and dogs and chubby rabbits. And I mean, they will laugh for days. Even drawings of chubby animals. Am I missing something? I don't understand. But it's a really sort of gentle humour, but they're really into it. It distresses me because I'm thinking, I might be losing it here. Why don't I get why this is funny? But they're weird too, and the weird things they say, often really make me laugh. So, I think one of them will be a comic for sure.
Right. And when was the first time that they realised that Dad was famous? Dad was a comedian. Because I'm looking forward to that with my son. You know.
Yeah. The best advice I can give you, Joe, is to just let it happen. I mean, I once tried taking my kid to a show.
Yeah.
He was only about 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah.
It was. I flew him down to Melbourne. There was this big gig at the RACV club in Melbourne, and I sat him up at the sound desk, and I did my set. And it was about 10 o'clock at night. I came back expecting him to be going, and he was like. So it's very grounding having kids, mate.
Yeah. And how did you go with homeschooling?
Oh. Mate, the whole schooling part of the pandemic distresses me because I feel like I've done this shit before. Why am I doing maths? One of my kids asked me if a number was a prime number the other day.
Yeah.
I said, listen, mate, I'm a comedian. You know, I was lighting farts when I was in high school. Not doing this shit. You work it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find that, you know, when you're trying to help them out? I haven't done it because my kid's too young, but my friends had this that they were looking at some of the kids' work and they just had no idea how to do it, or that, you know, why are you even learning this, because you're never going to use this in your adult life.
Yeah, I don't want to tell them that. I'll let them make that conclusion themselves. I don't want to put them off the rails, but yeah, it's distressing when they don't get it, because my kids are sort of, you know, 18 and 16 now, and they're doing stuff that I don't understand. I mean, I'm reading some of my daughter's essays now, and she's using words that, you know, I've got to go and look them up in the dictionary, mate. She's just like light years ahead of me.
Well, your daughter's fairly bright, isn't she?
She's doing great.
Yeah.
I'm just not even on her level, but she still comes to me for advice. I say, listen, ask someone who knows. You know, that's not me.
Yeah. And who did you use as an inspiration for your career? Who you know, in terms of, you know, let's talk get a bit more philosophical here. You know, who were the kind of people that inspired you and helped and changed the way that you saw things in life?
As I said, Joe, I loved comedy, and you know, when I was a kid, and probably this would apply to you too, there was a lot of comedy movies on TV. I mean, I would spend my weekends watching Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin and Abbott and Costello and the Three Stooges and Ma and Pa Kettle and all these great old Hollywood comedies, and they still stand up today, mate. They're absolutely brilliant. As I got a bit older, I got more into sort of, you know, Monty Python and the Goons and the Goodies, and I've always loved Jerry Lewis. He'd be the most inspirational to me. I find even his worst movies just I just lose it. You know, even in his sort of most innocent ways, I find him terribly funny. In the corporate world, I had a number of guys who are still out there that I've always admired how they work and how they've maintained their careers. They're a good deal older than me, which is nice because it makes me feel like I can keep this going for a couple of decades yet. I'm going to need to pay off all my debts. So look, I find great speakers inspiring too, and the real beauty of working in the corporate world is that not only do I get to see great entertainers, I get to see great speakers. I really admire good speakers, and oddly enough, all the very best ones, whether they're talking about finance, lifestyle, health, diet, whatever, all of the best speakers are very funny.
Yeah.
Very funny. And they always open their spiel with a couple of minutes of very insightful, very effective comedy. So it'll take you a long way.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you use comedy in a speech, the retention level increases dramatically. Yeah.
Absolutely. You've either got them or you haven't got them.
Yeah, and I have to ask you this: how has COVID changed the way you do things? I mean, I know I've been, and we had a chat about this the other day offline about doing Zoom comedy. It just doesn't seem to work. But
No.
how's it changed? I mean, I know obviously
We're not put us out of business for a while. I mean, unless I'd like to say unless you're on TV, but I don't find anyone on TV. As I said before, I find TV just a complete dead end. I mean, TV a long time ago stopped being a place for serious entertainers and is now a place for everyone, for someone who's trying to get married, lose weight, renovate a house, whatever. I mean, they're the TV stars of today. I don't find any so-called comedian on TV funny at all. If you're not on stage, mate, you're not a comedian, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. I don't care how many panels you can speak on or whatever, you are not a comedian. Yeah. So, but I find this pretense of being a comedy persona on TV just completely naff. I mean, I can't switch off fast enough, to be honest with you.
Yeah, there's a lot of people doing. I mean, look, it's very easy to record a video and edit it and hide behind the editing. But like you said, I agree with you. Unless you're actually getting up on stage and doing it,
that's the only place where comedy, has any gravity, has any traction.
Yeah. Now, you also recently hosted a travel show, didn't you?
Yes, I'm really into my travel. Called Hello World. So I'm the kind of correspondent for Italy and France, unfortunately. Right. So it's great. I get to travel, and I've been doing a lot of travel with them. It's all that's been hit on the head too during COVID.
No, of course.
I've really had a double whammy with COVID. I mean, I can't travel and I can't work on stages. So I have been I've been doing a lot of writing. Yep. I've just finished a piece for the Daily Telegraph that'll be in next week too about our state premiers. I love injecting a bit of humour into politics and society. So I love to write, Joe. I actually think I'm a better writer than I am a comic. And one day when the body gives up, I will just write. Yeah,
we'll get to that in a minute because I've actually got a question about that. Let's just go back to the travel for a sec. Where's the best place? Because I love travelling too, obviously, and I'm lucky that my job can take me around the world too. But where's the best place you've been to? The most fascinating place?
Who's your favourite child, mate?
Well,
there's a lot of great places.
Top five.
I've always been in love with the Italian Riviera.
Yeah.
I mean, the first time I saw Portofino as a 14-year-old, I was determined to live there one day. I had my honeymoon there, and I love the Amalfi Coast as well. I love Zermatt. I love the Matterhorn. I love New York. I lived in New York for a while. I absolutely adore New York. I love London. I recently went to Istanbul just before COVID hit, and
that twice.
Really blew me away. That's
what a great
amazing
city.
Yeah. And I love to. I mean, I really love food too. So I try and specialise in food. And I'm working on a new food TV project at the moment, actually. But I love food and travel. And food is a major driver of travel, particularly about people, particularly for people in my demographic. So the food in Istanbul is mind blowing. Tokyo, great food, great city. Dubai, that's an interesting city. I've been to Dubai a dozen times and never left the airport, but leave the airport. It's incredible, absolutely mind-blowing place. It really is it's a look into the future. It's like living on another planet. It's even too hot to go outside. You just sort of run from your car into the next air-conditioned space, but it's sort of like living on Mars, if you know what I mean. You can't breathe the air, but it's mind-blowing what interior architecture can create. And for that, it's worth a visit on its own. Amazing.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned writing. So tell us a little bit more about that. Why do you like writing? And there was one point that I remember you and I had a discussion about because, as you know, I live in Melbourne, but I'm from Sydney.
Yep.
So this whole Sydney-Melbourne rivalry, and you summed it up really well. Tell us a little bit more about that, because you did write a piece. I think you did write did you write a piece about Sydney-Melbourne, or you
I've written a synopsis for a documentary called The Great Divide about Sydney Melbourne rivalry, because I think that I think it's the greatest rivalry in Australia. I think if you try and divide this country, you know, you might divide it into sort of the haves and the have-nots, or the city and the bush, or or through ethnicity or religion. But I think the biggest divide is whether you are Sydney or Melbourne, and they are two vastly different places. You couldn't get two cities anywhere in the world that were only 1,000 kilometres apart that were so different. I mean, topographically different. We play different sports. We divide each other on different criteria. We genuinely think differently. Plus, there's the rivalry there, obviously, which is the premier city. But it's a fantastic thing to examine, Sydney-Melbourne rivalry. Sydney really is just a collection of villages. You know, you don't live in Sydney. You live in the eastern suburbs, or the North Shore, or the outer west, or the northern beaches, or what have you. It's very sort of it's divided into sort of bays and rivers and points, and whereas Melbourne is a bit more homogenous. So you need other ways of dividing yourselves. So class is more important in Melbourne. Footy club is more important. Religion is more important. How much money you've got is more important in Melbourne. It's a fascinating discussion, Sydney Melbourne, but the rivalry has always been there, even in the comedy fraternity. They used to say through most of my career, and probably still today, I'm one of the few Sydney comics that Melbourne comics get on with.
Yeah,
there's a lot of Melbourne in me for some reason. I don't know what that means, but I don't see many of my Sydney cohort comedians being invited to Melbourne comedy events like I am. I feel just as much a part of the Melbourne comedy community as I do Sydney. I love the Melbourne comics. I've done a lot of work in Melbourne.
Trouble hearing you.
That was Siri there.
Oh, right.
That wasn't a question, Siri.
Yeah, and I think you also said that Sydney, because it is a beautiful city, people are always looking out. I think you said.
In Sydney, you look out. In Melbourne, you look in. In Sydney, it's about the view.
Yeah.
In Melbourne, it's about the aspect. Look, Sydney's got it. I could go on forever about it. Sydney doesn't have to work as hard. We've got the harbour and the beaches and the weather, and it's just beautiful. If you don't like it, piss off. But in Melbourne, they have to try to be a city. They do try very hard, and they do succeed very well. There's a lot more effort in Sydney than Sydney in Melbourne. So it's actually the most interesting dialogue about the great Sydney-Melbourne rivalry was by David Williamson, the great author, who wrote Emerald City. He was a Melburnian who moved to Sydney. But his analysis of Sydney is absolutely spot on. We just spend our entire lives getting closer and closer to the harbour, like making more money, and when you're finally there, that's when you can cark it.
Now, before we, I'm kind of mindful of time here, I got two more questions for you. What do you define a comedian as, or being a comedian? Like, what does it mean to you, what you do?
It's an interesting question. Well, you've already heard my view about so-called panel comedians, but there's a place for them as well. There's a place for comedy in newspaper editorials, in cartoons, in YouTube videos, in memes, in Instagram. I mean, the comedy has a far larger footprint these days than it did decades ago, when it was just, if you weren't on radio or TV or in movies and radio or music or on a cabaret stage, but these days there's a lot more avenues to be funny. So I think the definition of a comedian has consequently become broader. So I really wouldn't be able to define it very easily today, what a comedian is.
Yeah. And how do you, I mean, like for me, what fascinates me about what we do is that you're really asking a room full of strangers who are strange to you and to themselves, really, unless they've come in a group, to have a simultaneous involuntary reaction to what you're saying. I find that very sort of fascinating about what we do. You know, that you can make 500 or 1,000 or 30 people all laugh at the same time. I think that's
I think at the base level, comedy really is people understanding each other. Like when you laugh at someone, you are saying to that person, I get it. You know, that's why it's such a powerful communication tool. How often have you laughed at something that you didn't get, but you didn't want to look like an idiot? You said, yeah. That's in us all. You know, we laugh to show that we are the equal, or that we understand each other. And I think that's why comedy is such a powerful instrument for interacting with people.
Yeah. Now, Vince, you're 60, you said. You're looking pretty good. So my last question is, what do you do to live your best life?
Oh, mate, you got to exercise. I've always been a huge believer in exercise, and honestly, hand on heart, there'll be rarely a day in a week that I won't exercise, that I won't either go for a big walk or get on the bike or lift some weights or have a swim. I'm a huge believer in it. I think it's not only good for your body, but it's very good for your mind. If I've got important shows coming up, I mean, I think back on some of the busiest days of my year, like, you know, an AFL Grand Final day with, you know, where I've got sort of a half a dozen gigs on. I've got to be here, there. And I start the day with a big run or a swim. I think it's very important for this as well as the body. You know, so my and food. I eat really well. I never ever eat anything that comes out of a can or a box. If I can't make it or put it together, it's not on the menu. Yeah. So eat well, exercise, and be happy, for goodness sake. That's especially in these COVID times. That's a challenge. You know, being happy and being really happy is the biggest challenge of all. Sometimes we get by thinking, oh yeah, I'm kind of happy because this is going, but are you really happy? That's a big question.
Yeah. Vince, thank you very much for your time, mate, and your insight. It's been very good. I've really enjoyed this chat, and I'm sure that our listeners will enjoy it as well. And I really thank you for giving us an insight into what it was like, you know, especially starting out. So thanks very much, mate, and have a great day.
You're very welcome, Joe. Good luck with the show.
Thank you. Cheers.